Christianity has to do with church. Science has to do with science. Have you thought about this? I mean, Colson brings this up. He says, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is there are more Christians than ever before. The bad news is it doesn't seem to be making any difference. Now, that may or may not be true on a large scale, but in terms of fundamental approaches to life in the world, we fill the churches and mega churches, and we do that sort of thing. And I'm not against the mega church or even bringing people in, that sort of thing, but it doesn't seem to be translating in how we do business. It certainly doesn't be translating how we do family. When the divorce rate inside the church and outside the church is almost identical, then there's something going on here. When entertainment choices and entertainment and what the rates of consumption of entertainment is the same inside the church and outside the church, there might be, and the way we consume entertainment is the same inside the church and outside the church, there might be something going on here. Secondly, they cannot defend their faith against other worldviews. And they'll face that. Third, and I think these are more rooted in these last two. So these are symptoms. I think these are the sources. The first one, they may know Bible content, but they don't know how to think biblically. That's not the same thing. You can know the Bible and not know how to approach life biblically. Some of you probably know people who know the Bible more than you, and they're not even believers, right? I know people like that. But here's what I'm saying. The point of the Bible isn't to know the Bible. God didn't give us His Word just to memorize it and learn it and regurgitate it. That's not why we're given the Bible. The point of the Bible isn't the Bible. The authority of the Bible isn't the Bible. The authority of the Bible is God. The point of the Bible is not to know the Bible, but it's to know God, myself, and the world. Now, you can't know the world and God and self outside of knowing the Bible, but you can certainly know Bible and not know God, self, and the world. You see what I mean? They don't necessarily translate here. And we have that. And I'm an example of this. I grew up in a Christian school. I mean, when I graduated from kindergarten, we had learned a verse for every letter in the alphabet in the King James. Even Q. Quit you like men, be strong. It's in Esther, I think. I was good at sword drills. Remember sword drills? I mean, I want to be, humble as a Christian here, but I was the man at sword drills. I could take people down. There was a disconnect between what I knew to be true and who Jesus was, but there was no fundamental orientation towards life that came out of this. In other words, what I'm saying is they don't have a biblical worldview. Now, some of you have studied worldview, and it's almost become an offensive category because it came out of some heritage. But here's what I'm saying by worldview. I'm not saying a biblical set of categories, intellectual categories. My understanding of worldview is a view of the world and a view for the world. It's a view of life that orients your view for life. In other words, it's a fundamental orientation towards life. In fact, what we're seeing instead is that many Christians are existentialists with a twist. Or they're postmodernists with heaven tacked on at the end. Or they have a Muslim view of God, like Job's friends did. In fact, if you work with students and you haven't seen this book, please add this to your list as well. And that's Soul Searching. Soul Searching was written by a guy named Christian Smith, who's a sociologist of religion at University of North Carolina. He did the largest survey of Christian teenagers that's ever been done at University of North Carolina through their study of American evangelicalism. Now, what's interesting is that he found a lot of things that surprised him. There's some typical things that go around about Christian teenagers, like they're spiritual but not religious, that sort of thing, or they don't really like church, they want to have their person. And he found that really wasn't true by and large. There were examples of that, but that really wasn't true. What he found that was astounding was when he actually asked them to articulate what Christianity was, that they were profoundly unable to define and to even articulate what it was to be a Christian or what Christianity actually was. In fact, he saw it. When he saw what they said, he put it together and concluded that it wasn't Christianity. In fact, one of his great lines is, these kids can tell you everything you want to know about will and grace, but they really can't tell you anything about grace. And he said that basically when it came out, their worldview wasn't Christianity, it was moralistic therapeutic deism. Here's moralistic, that God wants me to be good. Now, not God wants me to be holy or anything like that. It was just God wants me to behave. God wants me to be kind to animals and good to other people and tolerant of views and, just a good, kind person. Pretty much everyone's good is what he found that they believed, except for, Hitler and Genghis Khan. Therapeutic. Not only does God want me to be good, but God wants me to be what? Happy. God wants me to feel good. That the point of Christianity is to be a good person and to have good feelings about life, to be up. And then the third thing was he called deism. And now deism is the idea that God created the world but doesn't have anything to do with it. And it was a nuanced version of that, as he saw it in their life, is that God was there when they needed him, but other than that, they didn't really see how he connected to life. In other words, when they had trouble being happy, when they felt down, and when they had trouble being good, when they felt like they needed a pick-me-up, then they had to phone a friend whose name was God. But there was no radical orientation. Now, there's a couple things to notice about this view of God. One is that it's profoundly narcissistic, isn't it? That Christianity somehow becomes about me. And we say this. What's the gospel? How you can get to heaven. How you can get right with God. No, the gospel is the story of God in the world that was brought to bear by the God-man, Jesus Christ. The gospel is Jesus. It's not about me. My story gets wrapped up in his. That's the good news. That's the gospel. So it's profoundly narcissistic. Secondly, it doesn't look anything like Orthodox Christianity, does it? Third, do you see how profoundly fragile this is? Why is it fragile? Why is it fragile? Especially for a student who kind of grew up in a Christian community like the southern communities that we have here, and then goes off and gets exposed to broader other worldviews and that sort of thing. Why do you think it's so fragile? Yeah, what do you think? It's circumstantial. That's a great way to put it, isn't it? Because when you get to the broader world, you realize that there are other things that can help you be good. And there's certainly other things that can help you feel better. And they don't require going to church and listening to a boring sermon every week. It becomes unnecessary. Schaeffer had a different idea. He said Christianity is not a series of these little truths, but truth spelled with a capital T. Truth about total reality, not just about religious things. Christianity is truth concerning total reality, the intellectual holding of that truth, and then the living in light of that truth. So what needs to be done? They had a fundamental orientation towards reality that was like God's orientation towards reality. But secondly, he found this, that they were connected with others who value a biblical worldview. In other words, they were part of a community that was oriented towards life in the world this way. Unfortunately, a lot of our students have a narcissistic view of the world because their parents have a narcissistic view of the world. And their youth pastors have a narcissistic view of the world. And their pastors and their grandparents and their neighbors and their friends and their churches have it's all about us. It's all about how you can be happy. It's all about how you can feel better. Therapeutic messages week after week after week after week after week where we can get what we need from God. And there's no sense of a bigger picture of vision or community. In fact, this is what Proverbs calls vision. And when there is no vision, the people what? Perish. In fact, the translation here is they cast off restraint. They live lawlessly. Now, this is brilliant because it's always astounded me until I started looking at my own life as a Gen Xer. But it astounds me how this generation of students is so profoundly comfortable with duplicitousness. In other words, they're so profoundly comfortable doing this here, saying, I love Jesus, and then having a MySpace page that's just unbelievable. Do you know what I mean? And see, here's what we need to understand. The reality has changed. As two authors wrote, it ain't the way it used to be. When you are a generation, the generation before the computer and the internet is linear. You start here, you end here. But everything in these students' lives are, you start here, go up here, go here. The next time you go, you're here, and here. It's just like surfing the internet. Their life is like this. It's a life of disconnection, not a life of a vision, of a flow. It's a disconnected one. Does that make sense? And they see life like this. Profoundly disconnected. So what happens in this episode of my life won't impact this episode. I can be a worship leader